Alrighty, welcome to another week of Canon Calls. I am your host, Jake McAtee, and this week I had the pleasure to speak with Steve Alpert, former vice president of Studio Ghibli in Japan. We talked about his brand new book, Sharing a House with the Never-Ending Man, 15 Years at Studio Ghibli. I really couldn't recommend the book enough. Go get it on Amazon and everywhere else it's available. On the episode, we talk about the advice John Lasseter of Pixar gave him very early on. We talked about his meetings with Harvey Weinstein and, of course, the legend of Hayao Miyazaki. Before we get started, I wanted to draw your attention to a book on our shelf, which is our beautiful edition of George Macdonald's The Princess and the Goblin. This is one of the best fairy tales ever told, written by George Macdonald, a master storyteller. This book is the kind of book that will keep both children's and adults' attention as they wait to find out what happens to Princess Irene and Curdy as they go underground near the kingdoms of the goblins. Not to mention, the cover was provided by our very own in-house illustrator, Forrest Dickinson of Netflix's Hello Ninja fame. It's tough to beat. Get Macdonald's Princess and the Goblin at canonpress.com today, and without further ado, meet Steve Alpert. Alrighty, now welcoming on special guest Steve Alpert, author of Sharing a House with the Never-Ending Man, 15 Years at Studio Ghibli. Steve, thank you so much for coming on and putting up with some technical difficulties.
Thank you for having me.
So first things first, if you could just pretend that most folks listening maybe have never heard of Studio Ghibli or anything about the career of Miyazaki. Can you introduce us to Studio Ghibli? What is it?
Studio Ghibli is a studio that produces only theatrical length feature animation.
Okay.
And they still do it by hand. So that means, animated films that are meant to be seen in a movie theater, which these days is beginning to seem like something from the past.
Right.
It's really, I would say it's probably Japan's most successful film studio of any type. Hayao Miyazaki has received numerous awards for his films, including the Golden Bear at the Berlin Film Festival and Academy Award in the U.S. At this point, they've made 20 some odd films, and most of the films that they've made were number one in the box office in the year they came out in Japan. They've been doing this since 1984.
Okay.
What else can I tell you?
You started at the studio in Japan in 1996, correct?
Sounds like it. Yeah.
How long had the studio been going before you got there?
Well, they started in 1980, when I get it right, 1984. Nausicaa, The Valley of the Wind was their first film. And Hayao Miyazaki spent 7 years writing serial, manga is the word in Japanese, I guess. I don't know what they call it, graphic novel these days.
Yeah.
Right? And he had this going for 7 years. And they then made it into a film, an animated film, in 1984.
So if you started in 96, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What were you up to that you suddenly dropped in on Studio Ghibli?
Well, I was working for the Walt Disney Company in Japan. I was in they call it the studio side of the business. Disney's roughly divided into studio, theme parks, and consumer products. So I was in the studio part of it. I was president of Disney TV Animation at the time.
Wow.
It sounds like a lot, but it's actually a lot smaller than it sounds.
So what brought you there? I mean, was animation something you always loved? Was it the business side of things that fueled you? What was it that you decided to do that for a living?
I know it's complicated, and I should probably have a better answer for that than I have. But I studied Japanese in college way back in the 1970s.
Okay.
And I was in graduate school at Columbia studying Japanese literature.
Okay.
And I decided that academics really wasn't for me. And I transferred to the business school. And I've been working in various businesses ever since then.
Okay. One thing that I've heard you talk about is you got advice from John Lasseter about how you should introduce Miyazaki to Disney executives. Can you tell me about that?
That's right. Yes, I got a lot of advice from a lot of different times. It's hard to imagine now that he's become so famous, but in those days, Pixar was a small studio. Toy Story hadn't been released, and they were operating out of trailers in Richmond, which is, sort of, you know where that is? It's near Berkeley.
Yeah.
Just, hard to believe, right? It's a long and interesting story, but he knew Hayao Miyazaki from, when they were both just starting out in animation. And John advised me that the Disney executives wouldn't really get Japanese animated films, but the animators in the studio would. So in order to get them to screen the films in the US, we had to first do a test screening, in America. And he said, make sure that when you set up the screening, it has to be in a large screening room. Disney has all, if you don't know, but film studios and like in Hollywood have all these screening rooms where executives look at the films. A lot of them are just big sofas and, maybe 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people will watch the film. And then they have big auditoriums. So he said, do it in the auditorium, invite all the Disney animators, and that when the executives come, they'll see that the animators are really enjoying the film and they'll think more highly of the film. So we went to a lot of trouble and managed to do that. And Spirited Away started. This was when the film, Ghibli's film Spirited Away, started to get a lot of awards. It won the Berlin Film Festival.
Okay.
And suddenly, a lot of the executives at Disney became aware of the film. And Michael Eisner, who was the chairman of the studio, suddenly he wanted to attend the screening. And so if Eisner is attending, all the people that work for him want to attend, and all the people that work for them want to attend. And pretty soon they kicked out all the animators, and It was only a giant audience of Disney executives, businessmen, guys who are, like watching the movie while reading their memos on their phones, things like that. So it didn't work out very well for us, even though we tried to follow John's advice.
Right.
Believe it or not, Pixar actually had the same problem as we had at the time. When they first made Toy Story, a lot of the Disney executives didn't think anybody would want to watch a CG animated film, about a lot of toys coming to life. And I remember I was at a cocktail party in Los Angeles at the time, and I mentioned to the head of Disney Studios that Toy Story was about to come out, and I thought, wow, this is going to be great. I'd seen bits and pieces of it. It looked fantastic. And he looked at me and he goes, yeah, Steve, people like you will like it, but nobody else is going to want to watch this film.
Wow.
So
does that guy still have a job?
I'm sure he's the president of some other studio at this point. And the upshot was that, obviously it became so popular once it was released that Michael Eisner himself was unable to get a Buzz Lightyear, one of the toy Buzz Lightyear, for one of his kids because they made so few of them that they'd all sold out.
That's hilarious. I
thought so. Yeah, I thought so. But anyway, so John Lasseter was giving me advice based on a lot of problems he also had with Disney at the time.
So Miyazaki is practically synonymous with Studio Ghibli. Can you introduce us to him a little bit? You mentioned he was the director of most of those films that received the awards. Who is this guy?
Right. So He's about, so I'm 70 and he's about 10 years older than I am.
Okay.
He comes from a family, an old kind of an industrial family in Japan, and he's like the black sheep of the family. A lot of his relatives, his brothers, are all famous doctors. Not all, but some of them. And, when he told his family that he was going to be an animator, or a guy who drew, I guess the graphic novels, but manga, the word in Japanese, they weren't happy. But he did it anyway. He graduated from Gakushuin, which is one of Japan's most prestigious schools, and he majored in, to get this right, I think economics and philosophy, something like that.
Okay.
And he took that into a career of animation. And he and Isao Takahata, who was the other director at Studio Ghibli, was his mentor. And they made a lot of really famous TV animation before, but they always really wanted to make feature-length animation, animation that you would go to a movie theater and see. So TV animation, real films that took 90 minutes or 2 hours and told an important story.
Sure.
And in those days, that was very unusual. Movie theaters wouldn't show an animated film unless it was a double feature, because they figured, nobody would go unless they were getting their money's worth. So when Ghibli first started, whenever they made a film, they had to either make a second film to go with it, or they had to find another studio that was making an animated film that would be ready at the same time. So, yeah, it's hard. Yeah. So now they're so successful. I don't know the numbers anymore because I've forgotten them, unfortunately. But the year I joined Studio Ghibli, Princess Mononoke was the film that was being made, and when it came out, it broke every single box office record. The previous box office record was held by E.T., which released in, I guess, 1983, and it just blew past that by so much that all of a sudden everybody was really, wanting to pay attention to Studio Ghibli and Hayao Miyazaki. What's going on with this guy? But previously, he had made a film called My Neighbor Totoro, which in Japan is that's kind of like the Wizard of Oz used to be for us here, where, it would be on TV once every year. And when it was on, just about every person in Japan would watch it.
You got there in 1996. Yep. What did they hire you to do?
Get the films released outside of Japan. So somebody in the parent company of Studio Ghibli had licensed Nausicaa, the Valley of the Wind, the first film. And so a U.S. contract for films could be like 200 pages long, but a Japanese contract is like a 1 page long. They hardly specify anything. And the people who licensed the film decided to cut it and change the name. And Miyazaki found out about that, and he said, okay, that's it. I'm not ever releasing any of my films out of Japan again. And he refused to allow them to do that. So when I joined, none of the films that had been made, since from, 1985, 86 and onward had ever been released except for pirate editions outside of Japan. So it was my job to do that. And it was a lot more difficult than I thought it would be, say that.
So what were some of the big struggles that maybe you didn't see coming?
We were working with Disney, my former company, and it's a really big company, and there are so many, there are a lot of different people who have different opinions, but the international people tended to appreciate Ghibli films, but the domestic people didn't like them so much. And, the first thing we discovered, when the Ghibli had made this contract with Disney, it never occurred to them that Disney would decide not to release the films. So that was really the first big thing, is that, they thought a lot of the films were not appropriate for an American audience and wouldn't release them. Even in those days, it was video.
I imagine one thing that will stand out to a lot of folks, you document several of the meetings that you had with Harvey Weinstein.
All right.
How did those go? What was that like?
Well, I have to say, it was interesting. I mean, I have to say, all the sexual stuff that's come out since, we had no idea whatsoever.
Sure.
I mean, that was just absolutely mind-boggling, I guess. But,
right.
We didn't have any idea about that. But he's a very, there's this expression, the person sucks all the air out of the room.
Yeah.
I never understood what that expression meant until I met Harvey. He was a very large personality. And New York, I mean, New York people tend to yell a lot, and it's not such a big deal. But he had a temper, and occasionally he would yell, and threaten, and throw things.
So,
but I have to but Miyazaki and my boss Toshio Suzuki really liked him. I mean, for one thing, he smoked, and they still are smokers. So they unrepentant smokers tend to appreciate other unrepentant smokers.
Sure.
But I mean, aside from all the sexual stuff, he was a guy who got a lot of really excellent films made that otherwise wouldn't have been made. And his personality aside, he did a lot for the I guess you call the art house film circuit.
So one question that I had as I kind of read your book, and I'm vaguely familiar with the Studio Ghibli timeline, is as the guy whose job it was to get these films distributed,
right.
You guys you document several issues, whether it was with Disney and Miramax about, they may have shortened it, or you played a big role with translating,
right,
etc. So there were these issues. In hindsight, do you ever think, getting me? So I'll say this, and then you react to it. It seemed to me,
sure.
Knowing Miyazaki and the thematic elements of his movies, and it seems like a stretch to think that they would fly with big American producers unchecked or unchanged entirely. Does that sound right to you?
I'm not sure what you mean. Could you explain that a little more?
Sorry. So it seems like, of course, American producers are going to feel like they have to change this movie because of just how weird it is to, especially their Western sensibilities, in terms of, we have to make our goal is to get the most profit ever out of these movies. Of course we're going to have to make changes. Did you guys expect that, or were you thinking these will get through?
No. So, I mean, that's really the thing. I spent almost my entire career in Japan. And, I think I said before, the Disney people, which I was one of at one point, who work internationally, I don't think they don't think like that. And it was a surprise. It was a big surprise that, that Americans reacted, the American part of Disney reacted that way to the films. I did not expect it.
Okay.
It really was a big surprise. And we started one of the first things we did was dubbing Princess Mononoke into English. We had a really great cast. It took a long time and actually a lot of money, but nobody that was doing it had any experience, because here in America, we don't dub foreign films. I don't know. We don't watch that many foreign films, but we don't dub them.
Right.
Into English, whereas every place in the world they do. And so they have people who are really good at it and know how to do it and know how to do it really well and really cheaply. I mean, I always tell people, I used to watch Star Trek when I lived in Japan. And I thought Star Trek is so much better in Japanese. They do a really great job dubbing it. Mr. Spock really sounds cool.
Really?
Oh yeah, it's great.
That's
And
hilarious.
there are a lot of TV shows like that where I feel that way, but that's because they have people who do that for every single foreign film that's shown there.
Right.
But in the US, we don't do it. So Miramax at that time had just done, I think had just done The English Patient, which was hugely successful. And they thought a lot of their foreign films, which were great films, would do better if they dubbed them. And they no experience dubbing. So Princess Mononoke was going to be their first time learning how to dub a foreign film.
Okay.
So they wanted to do everything they could. And I never saw it, but somebody told me, actually the first one they did was a film called Il Postino. I don't know if you know that film. South American film, I think.
Okay.
Great film. And they dubbed that, and they screened it a couple of times, and people just laughed. It was so hilarious. So they thought, okay, let's back up. It should be easier to do with an animated film, than live action film. So this was their chance to try and get that down so they could, make more money, I guess, with the really excellent foreign films that they were releasing.
Right. Can you speak to a little bit about the translations? You played a big part in that.
Right. Well, first of all, translations, whenever you translate anything, if you get it right, no one will say anything. But no matter what you do, there will be people who will find things that are wrong with it, and they will not be wrong because it's really, it's not. Translation is difficult, but translating for movies is even more difficult because you have these images on the screen already, and your translation has to be accurate, but it also has to fit exactly the mouth movements on the screen.
Right.
So, Japanese tends to be a lot longer than English.
Right.
So, you're constantly trying to get the meaning right, but also trying to fit it to if it's a subtitle, the timing, and if you're dubbing, to the mouth movements. So you have that extra hurdle you have to go through.
Right. And then you worked with Neil Gaiman as well, right?
Yeah, that was a pleasure.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
Can you talk about his role and maybe just what it was like working with him?
Yeah, he lived in Minnesota at that time, and he flew in for the meetings in New York, and he was a real champion of trying to keep the translation, trying not to add things, let's say, to the film. In other words, Hayao Miyazaki made this film, and it's not our place to make changes. We're just trying to do the best we can to represent what the original filmmaker wanted to show in the film. The Miramax people had, besides that, wanted to do what was commercially viable. And also, I guess, so Miyazaki, one thing about all of Miyazaki's films is that he likes things to be kind of vague. He doesn't believe in resolutions or, good guys and bad guys and that kind of thing. And the Miramax people wanted to add things that would make the plot, let's say, a little more complete, a little more rational, a little more understandable. Get rid of the vague things.
Sure.
So they added stuff. They added stuff, and my job was to cut all that stuff out. And fortunately, Neil was on my side for that. But also, we, as I said before, none of us had any experience, and we didn't really know how it was going to go. And so what Neil did was he took the subtitles from the film and he rewrote it, as perfectly as it could be,
right,
without any just the lines perfectly. Like if you were doing it from scratch, these would be what the line should say. It was great. But then the problem was, you have to take that and fit it to the mouth movements and what's already up there on the screen. And that's a more difficult process. And the communication between Miramax and Neil and us was a little imperfect. And so we did have some problems there.
So would that mean it would go back to animators to essentially cut back on
No.
on the mouth movements?
No.
Okay.
No. Nobody's touching the film. So it's just it's what you can do is you can change the dialogue.
Got it.
So they wrote things that weren't in the film. They made up things, and people who didn't understand Japan, they were writing things that no one in Japan would ever agree to.
Sure.
Not Neil, but
right.
The other people at Miramax who were doing the cutting. So, and they had this attitude. Well, the Miramax people had this attitude where you submit something, and if they don't like it, that's it. You're out. You're out of the loop.
Right.
A couple of times they said to me, if the actor doesn't do it right, we just fire him and get somebody else. And you're talking about some pretty talented and famous people here. So
yeah.
So it was it was a learning experience.
Yeah. As you look over that time, you mentioned, this job turned out to be a lot more difficult than you thought it would be. In terms of...
But fun, though.
But fun.
But I have to say but fun.
So would you see, just as a whole in the past, getting Miyazaki's vision for animation and art and everything else, has that been successfully translated over into English?
Yes and no. One of the things when I first started doing this, and I told Suzuki-san, who was the president of the studio and the producer of all the films, I told him that I was going to translate all the films because you need to, but also because I really wanted to.
Yeah.
He didn't want me to translate the films. He said, we don't want the films translated. I said, well, how are you going to screen them in foreign countries? He said, well, if they want to watch them, they should learn Japanese. And I thought he was kidding, but he must have been, he seemed like he was serious. I can understand where he would feel that way, but for a while, I wasn't sure whether he was actually going to let me translate the films, but eventually he did. But one of the things he said was he wanted me to say, okay, you can translate the films, but the credits all have to be in Japanese. Okay. And I said, why would we do that? What's the point of having the credits if people can't read them? And he said, then people will know that it's a Japanese film. And I said, no, they won't. They'll think it's a Chinese film. You're just putting stuff on the screen that nobody can read, So eventually he relented and let me translate everything. But again, he wasn't wrong, because if you see these films in Japanese, you get a really complete picture of what the filmmakers intended. And there's no substitute for that, I have to say. So when we translate, we do the very best we can. There's a couple of examples in the book of things that we had to translate that show, sort of what's there in the Japanese, the best you can do in English, and sort of what you lose by not being able to hear it in the original language.
Right.
Sometimes, though, depending on the film, sometimes you actually can completely capture it. And, it's funny because the French versions of the Japanese films play really well. I think they play every bit as well as the original Japanese. There's something about translating into French that works. They had, for Miyazaki's film, Porco Rosso, Jean Reno played Porco Rosso, and Miyazaki-san thought he was better than the guy who did it in Japanese. He said, that's exactly the voice I was looking for. So, but sometimes you get these breakthroughs and it just works. But for most of the time, I would say you're missing something. So when we translate, we do the best we can to give you the feeling of the original, but there's always going to be something that's not just a little bit off,
Right.
or not as good as it could be.
Right. Well, Steve, I'm so grateful for the time that you've offered me. If you could recommend to somebody where to jump in with the Ghibli films and to be introduced to Miyazaki, where would you send them?
Well, I guess My Neighbor Totoro would be the first one,
Okay.
or Kiki's Delivery Service.
Okay.
But it really depends on who you are, how old you are, and what kind of films you like.
Right. Right.
My favorite film is still Nausicaa, the Valley of the Wind,
Okay.
although you're not supposed to have favorites. But I think Totoro, in terms of filmmaking and the film itself, would be my first. And I suppose I should mention Spirited Away, which won just about every award you could think of.
Did Miyazaki have a favorite film that he wasn't supposed to have?
No. No. They always say that they thought of their films as their children, and parents don't have favorite children, a favorite child.
They're not supposed to. Right? They're not supposed to.
They're not supposed to. But I really don't think Miyazaki does.
Okay. Mr. Alpert, thank you so much. Everybody can go get your book at Amazon, anywhere books are sold, I imagine. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.